Okay, so here's the number to start with. Building a single one of these things required roughly 100,000 tons of ballast, 78,000 tons of gravel, 35,000 tons of cement, and 9,200 tons of steel. That's not a typo, and that's not even the total for a whole city. That's the material bill for one tower out of 16 that Nazi Germany eventually built across Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. These were the Flaktürme, the Flak Towers. Reinforced concrete anti-aircraft fortresses so absurdly overbuilt that 80 years later, most of them are still standing, and nobody has ever found an economical way to get rid of them. This is the story of what it actually cost to build one, what they actually accomplished, and why a weapon designed to shoot down airplanes ended up being remembered mostly for something else entirely. Picture the accounting problem from the perspective of a wartime planner in 1940. You're being asked to sign off on a structure that will consume steel and cement your tank factories, and U-boat pens are also fighting over, using a construction timeline measured in months rather than years, to build something whose stated purpose, shooting down enemy bombers, could, in theory, be handled by scattering the same guns across a dozen cheaper, more mobile positions instead. Nobody chose the Flak Tower because it was the most efficient way to kill bombers. They chose it because Hitler wanted Berlin to look and feel unassailable, and efficiency was never really the primary metric being optimized for. Beat the bill before a single shell gets fired. In August 1940, after the RAF carried out its first bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler personally ordered 3 massive flak tower complexes built to defend the capital, and took enough of a personal interest in the project to sketch some of the designs himself. The engineering, credited mainly to architect Friedrich Tams, called for paired structures at each site. A larger G tower, or Gefechtsturm, mounting the actual guns, and a smaller L tower, or Leitturm, a few hundred meters away, packed with radar and fire control equipment to aim them. The scale of what got built was genuinely staggering. Each G tower rose about 40 meters, roughly 128 feet, with a footprint close to 70 meters on each side, and walls up to 3.5 meters thick. More than 11 feet of solid reinforced concrete. Across just the Berlin complexes, construction historian estimates put total consumption at over 200,000 cubic meters of concrete and 18,000 metric tons of steel, materials that were at that exact moment in desperately short supply everywhere else in the German war economy. To keep the flow of concrete and steel moving fast enough, the project disrupted Germany's national rail schedule and commandeered barges from as far away as France and the Netherlands just to haul raw material to the construction sites. Beat the labor bill nobody was paid for. Here's the part of the ledger that doesn't show up in any tonnage count. Each pair of towers went up in roughly 6 months, an almost impossible pace for a structure this massive, achieved only by running construction around the clock with as many as 3,200 workers at a time. A significant share of that workforce was forced labor. Prisoners of war and conscripted civilians brought in from occupied territories across Europe, working under the organization taught Nazi Germany's construction and engineering agency, essentially building fortresses to protect the capital of the regime that had taken them from their homes. This is the same grim accounting problem that shows up across almost every corner of the German war economy during this period. An enormous share of the cost of these projects was never actually paid in wages at all. It was extracted directly from people who had no ability to refuse the job, no ability to negotiate the hours, and if they were prisoners, often no reliable food or shelter of their own while building some of the most heavily fortified shelters on the continent for someone else. If you tried to price that labor honestly at anything resembling a fair wage for months of around-the-clock heavy construction work, The true cost of each tower complex would balloon well past whatever number appears in any surviving Reich budget line. That gap between the recorded cost and the real cost is, in miniature, one of the defining economic features of the entire Nazi war machine. An accounting system that could report impressively efficient project costs only because a large share of the actual labor input was simply never counted as an expense in the first place. Beat. What the towers were actually supposed to buy. On paper, the return on this enormous investment was straightforward: shoot down Allied bombers. Each G-tower typically carried 8 128mm Flak 40 guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, backed by dozens of smaller 20mm cannons for close-in defense, capable of a combined sustained rate of 7,000 to 8,000 rounds per minute across a full 360-degree arc, reaching targets more than 8 miles out and over 45,000 feet up. The nearby L Tower fed all of that firepower a continuous stream of targeting data from radar and optical rangefinders, letting multiple towers coordinate fire on the same incoming formation at once. That's an intimidating spec sheet, and it should have translated into a serious return on all that concrete and forced labor. Anti-aircraft fire as a whole genuinely was a major factor in the air war. Flak of all types accounted for roughly half of all American bomber losses over Germany, more than fighter aircraft did, according to post-war tallies. But Flak towers specifically, despite carrying some of the largest and most sophisticated anti-aircraft batteries in the entire German arsenal, turned out to be strikingly inefficient at the one job they were explicitly built to do. Post-war assessments, including the official Allied bombing surveys, describe heavy flak in general as expensive and only modestly lethal per shell fired, and the tower's guns, while individually powerful, simply couldn't generate enough hits per bomber to justify their cost as a pure kill ratio weapon. What they were unambiguously good at was forcing bombers to fly higher and adjust their approach to avoid the barrage, which measurably reduced bombing accuracy across the raids they defended against. A real, if much harder to put a price tag on, form of return. Put a number on it, and the inefficiency becomes almost comic. Firing at a sustained rate of thousands of rounds per minute across a raid, a single flak tower complex might expend an enormous quantity of expensive 128mm ammunition. Shells that were themselves precision manufactured, non-trivial to produce, for the statistical chance of downing 1 or 2 aircraft over the course of an entire engagement. Compare that to the raw material and labor cost of the tower itself, still being paid off in ammunition expenditure raid after raid, and the actual cost per bomber destroyed for this specific class of weapon sits dramatically higher than what a conventional, ground-mounted flak battery achieved using a fraction of the concrete and none of the multi-story fortress wrapped around it. Beat. The revenue stream nobody put in the original blueprint. Here's the twist that makes this a genuinely strange economic story rather than just a weapons story. The towers ended up delivering their single most valuable output almost by accident, and it wasn't anti-aircraft fire at all. It was shelter. Each tower was designed with room for around 10,000 civilians inside its lower floors, complete with its own water reservoir, food stores, generators, and a hospital ward. One Berlin tower reportedly had a 95-bed hospital with 2 full operating rooms. In practice, especially during the desperate final Battle of Berlin in 1945, occupancy blew straight past that design capacity, with as many as 30,000 people crammed into a single tower at once, forming makeshift communities inside walls originally poured to stop bomb fragments, not house triple the planned population. think about what that actually means in cost-benefit terms. The formal justification for the entire project: tons of steel, tons of cement, months of forced labor, a disrupted national rail network, was air defense, a mission the towers performed only middlingly well relative to their price tag. The unplanned secondary use of the same structure, a bomb-proof concrete fortress happening to also be an extraordinarily effective bunker, arguably saved more lives, at the margin, than the guns on the roof ever did. It's the wartime equivalent of a shopping mall discovering its real moneymaker was never the anchor department store everyone built the place around, but the kiosk nobody planned for sitting in the busiest hallway. There's a darker layer underneath even that silver lining, worth being honest about. Access to that shelter capacity wasn't distributed evenly or fairly among everyone living through the bombing. Space inside the towers during the most desperate raids went disproportionately to those with the connections, status, or simple physical proximity to get there first, while others were left in more exposed public shelters or basements offering nowhere near the same protection. The towers saved an enormous number of lives in absolute terms. They did not save lives in anything resembling an equitable way, which is its own kind of hidden cost sitting underneath the impressive occupancy numbers. Beat. The structural trap. Building something too permanent to ever get rid of. Here's where the Flak Tower story develops its own version of the hidden trap door that runs through every asset in this series. Except this time, the trap didn't spring during the war. It sprang decades after the war ended, when someone had to figure out what to actually do with these things. The same engineering that made the towers nearly impervious to Allied bombs, and later to direct assault by advancing Soviet forces. Walls thick enough that even Soviet 200 mm howitzers reportedly couldn't bring one down, made them almost impossible to demolish once they'd outlived their purpose. Berlin's Zoo Tower needed 3 separate demolition attempts. British engineers drilled more than 400 holes into the structure and packed it with tons of dynamite. An initial 25-ton charge failed to bring the whole thing down, and it eventually took somewhere in the range of 35 to 80 tons of explosives, spread across attempts and months of preparation, before the tower was fully leveled. Roughly half of the 16 towers across all 3 cities were eventually demolished or partially demolished through similarly expensive, drawn-out efforts. The other half were simply left standing because the cost and risk of removing a building engineered to survive a direct hit from heavy artillery sitting in the middle of a dense modern city routinely exceeded whatever value the land underneath it was actually worth. In Vienna specifically, occupying authorities didn't even seriously attempt systematic demolition of the city's 6 towers, citing exactly this math. The resources and engineering effort required simply weren't worth it. Those towers are still standing in Vienna today, more than 80 years after they were built, repurposed instead of removed. One now houses an aquarium. Another remains in use by the Austrian military. In Hamburg, one former Flak Tower has been converted into a media and events venue. Another became the anchor for an ambitious green energy redevelopment project, adding rooftop gardens and solar panels to a structure originally poured to shoot down Lancaster bombers. Run the numbers on that afterlife, and the irony gets sharper. A structure originally justified by its ability to destroy expensive Allied aircraft has spent the past 8 decades generating an entirely different kind of return. Tourism revenue from guided bunker tours, rental income from converted office and event space, and, in Hamburg's case, Actual electricity from solar panels bolted to a roof engineered to survive direct artillery hits. The Flak Tower's original owners spent a fortune building an asset that failed to reliably pay off on its own stated terms during the war it was built for, and then spent the rest of the 20th century unable to get rid of it, only for that same stubborn, over-engineered permanence to eventually become a genuine commercial asset once someone finally stopped trying to demolish it and started asking what else the thing was good for. Beat. What the whole comparison actually reveals, and the full accounting in the Flak Tower turns out to be one of the strangest capital assets of the entire war. A project justified almost entirely by a mission it performed only moderately well, that ended up paying its real dividends through a use case nobody had budgeted for. Built with labor that was never paid a wage in any conventional sense, and engineered with such extreme paranoid permanence that the bill for actually disposing of the asset would keep arriving for the next 80 years, and counting. Every other asset in this series eventually met some kind of economic resolution. A mall gets demolished and replaced by a warehouse. A tank gets destroyed or scrapped. A ship gets decommissioned. The Flak Tower is the one asset in this entire catalog that nobody has ever actually been able to close the books on. It just sits there, an enormous over-engineered fixed cost with no clean exit, quietly outliving the war, the regime that built it, and every original justification anyone gave for pouring that first ton of concrete in the first place. There's a lesson buried in that permanence that goes well beyond one strange chapter of military engineering. Build something purely for maximum survivability, with no thought at all given to how it might eventually be removed, and you haven't just built a defensive asset. You've built a liability with an open-ended lifespan, one that somebody, decades later, in a world its original builders never imagined, will still be trying to figure out what to do with. If a bunker nobody can figure out how to demolish just rewired how you think about permanent construction, send this to someone who still thinks concrete is boring. And subscribe. Every week, another system whose real logic was hiding in the numbers the whole time.